Natali.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. This budget, Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison's first, is a massive letdown for the people of Australia. Just as they've been let down by Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister, the people of Australia have been let down by this budget. It's a budget that doesn't properly address the fact that we have a revenue problem. It's a problem that was brought to us by John Howard and Peter Costello when they wasted the rivers of gold from the resources boom through round after round after round of tax cuts. It's a budget that hands out corporate tax cuts while locking in cuts to hospitals. It's a budget that hands over money to the highest income earners but cuts support to the most vulnerable families. It's a budget that spends billions harming people by locking them up on Nauru and Manus Island. It's a budget that continues to subsidise fossil fuels but rips funding away from clean energy. And it's a treasurer who can't even mouth the words global warming, the biggest economic and environmental challenge of our generation. Australia needs and deserves better. It deserves some courage and vision. Mr Acting Deputy President, the budget projections in the Treasurer's speech are heroic. Some would say fanciful. While revising near-term growth figures down to 2.5%, the government banks on them magically rebounding up to 3% in 2017-2018. Consider the context. We've got low commodity prices, we've got a slowdown in housing construction, we've got wages that are flat and we've got low inflation. Worse still, the government banks on investment in the non-mining sector growing to 3.5% in 2016-17 and a magical 4.5% by 2017-2018. All this on the same day that the Reserve Bank cut the interest rate in an effort to stimulate lending. I know whose projections I trust, whose advice I trust, and it's not this government's. The growth forecast is magical thinking. The fairies don't live at the bottom of the garden anymore. They live at the top end of town in Liberal Party headquarters. Australians deserve an honest budget, a fairer budget, a better budget, and that's what the Greens would deliver. Malcolm Turnbull promised that he would lead a transition to a new economy. He likes talking about the new economy a lot, does Malcolm Turnbull. He says that this budget is a plan for jobs and for growth. Well, at the heart of the transition to a new economy is the need to move away from those polluting sources of power to clean, cheap, renewable power. We need steel workers and manufacturers to make the blades and turbines that will capture the energy from the wind. We need tradespeople to install those turbines, the solar panels that capture energy from the sun. We need scientists to continue to work and develop concentrated solar thermal and wave technology. We need to be installing batteries to bring on the energy storage revolution. We need workers to manufacture the electric cars, the electric buses and trucks of the future. We need people to maintain this infrastructure to keep things humming along. And we need to ensure that workers, their families and communities are not left behind as coal goes into terminal decline. But this budget has no plan for that transition. It's completely silent. Well, the Greens have got a plan. We've got a detailed plan to renew Australia, a plan that would see 15,000 jobs across Australia in the design and construction of clean renewable energy projects right out to 2030. It's in line with global trends, which saw clean energy employ more than 7.7 million people across the world in 2014, according to the figures published by the International Renewable Energy Agency. The rest of the world knows that this future is here, it's coming, and that this century belongs to those nations that embrace this challenge, that embrace the transition. But our Prime Minister, our Treasurer, are stuck in the last century. Scott Morrison's budget uses the language of transitioning, but it leaves huge fossil fuel subsidies for dirty polluting industries intact, and it shovels more money into the exploration for more mining, more drilling, more fracking right across northern and southern Australia. Following the signing of the Paris Agreement, as we experience the shattering of records of global temperatures, witness the bleaching of our reefs, the burning of those ancient forests, a better budget would transition away from those old polluting industries to bright, new, clean, renewable energy. And we have choices. We don't have to rely on an arbitrary 2% of GDP defence spending target or $30 billion on armaments to support jobs in manufacturing. We can be building turbines rather than tanks. We can be building solar cities rather than strike fighters. Now, given this government's track record, it's hardly surprising that they're not up to the task. But I have to say that Labor's position is disappointing. They express concern for global warming, but their clean energy and emissions reduction targets take us to the brink of 2 degrees and possibly beyond, triggering catastrophic global warming. We had both the government and the Labor Party on a unity ticket, slashing the renewable energy target, and on a unity ticket when it comes to expanding our coal export industry. Now, I call on Bill Shorten tomorrow night in his budget in reply speech to categorically ruling out any support for Malcolm Turnbull slashing $1.3 billion from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, funding that has helped create renewable energy technologies that are so vital for job creation and investment that Australia so desperately needs. And I commit the Greens to fighting tooth and nail that we have a better budget that ensures that we have renewable energy to create a better, jobs-rich future. The Australian Greens will stand up for a fairer Australia. This budget should have been about reducing income inequality and securing the government's revenue base to fund schools and hospitals and other vital infrastructure. Instead, what do we get? We get growing inequality by providing huge corporate tax cuts and income tax cuts for people on high wages. We've got our schools and hospitals desperately needing of investment. We have economic challenges ahead. Now is not the time for unaffordable and unfair tax cuts that are effectively election bribes. The government's ripping $4 billion out of schools and hospitals for a $6 a week tax cut for people on above the average wage, offering them the old sandwich and a milkshake tax cut without the milkshake. The budget flagged $3.3 billion for schools and hospitals, but that doesn't come close to bridging that huge hole, that $80 billion that was ripped out of health and education. And I just ask the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, how can you look Australians in the eye and rip $6 billion out of universities, out of social support, out of Medicare, out of public sector jobs, when you are giving more than $12 billion in tax cuts and tax breaks to businesses, to high-income earners and to the super wealthy? Now, the Greens welcome the government's very small steps towards cracking down on multinational tax avoidance, including a Google tax, the beneficial owners register and whistleblower protections. They've taken some of the ideas that the Greens released in our comprehensive 18-point tax plan only 2 weeks ago. That's a good thing. And I've got to tell you, I am really proud to be leading this team, a team of people who are, in fact, at the forefront of the economic debate in this country. Whether it be on tax avoidance, whether it be on reform to superannuation, whether it be negative gearing, the Greens have been leading the economic debate in this country. We welcome the one-off injection to the Australian Taxation Office for their crack team of specialists, but let's also look closely at the budget papers and realise that what we see is a continued reduction of the resources to the ATO, and we know that the ATO has suffered from huge cuts over time, allowing those companies and individuals to avoid paying their fair share of tax. We think more needs to be done. There needs to be more efforts in diplomacy to force tax havens to share information. greater penalties for companies that use secrecy jurisdictions, and real, genuine support for whistleblowers. The change to superannuation's welcome, but it is also a missed opportunity for much bolder, much fairer reform in the super system. Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison had the support and goodwill of business groups, of civil society, the unions, indeed the whole parliament, to clamp down on those unfair tax breaks in the super system and to raise the money we desperately need to fund schools and hospitals. They weren't up for it. Now you just think about this. Someone on $250,000 continues to pay the same 15% tax rate on their contributions as someone on $60,000. That's not fair, and yet we've got the two old parties in this place who continue to support it. Genuine reform of our super system would have brought in 4 times as much revenue, made the system fairer and ensured that super worked in the way that it was intended. Schools, vocational education, higher education and research sectors, they should be the engine room for ideas, for innovation and for growth in the new economy that the Prime Minister just loves to spruik. But this budget starves all of these sectors, all for that tax cut worth a sandwich a week. High income earners, and I have to say, like those of us politicians in this place, we get 2 tax cuts out of this budget, 2 of them. We get the removal of the deficit levy and we get the change in the marginal rate from $80,000 to $87,000. I can tell you, we don't need it. Our colleagues, we don't want it. We think that those people, the average Australian, 3/4 of them on less than that $80,000 figure, they deserve something under this plan, and yet they get nothing. They get absolutely nothing. This is the very epitome of an unfair budget. Now consider those people who receive income support. They'll get less money because of the removal of the clean energy supplement. How is it that it is morally right to be reducing the income of people already on very low incomes and raising the incomes of people like us, those of us on higher incomes, with a double tax cut? That's not right, it's not fair. Now, the Treasurer talked a lot about growth in his budget. The IMF actually tell us that if you're concerned about growth, then the most effective strategy is to reduce inequality and raise incomes at the bottom end of the income scale. And yet this government has none of it. It's a budget that pays no heed to the advice of the IMF or other leading economists to reduce that income inequality, because we have a Prime Minister and a Treasurer who just don't care. Mr Deputy President, as a result of this budget, large corporations will benefit from a lower company tax rate, a tax cut that's purported to target small business. But let's look a little closer. Over the next 4 years, the government's proposing to increase the turnover threshold to $100 million. That's a weekly turnover of close to $2 million. Within 8 years, the threshold will increase to $1 billion, a weekly turnover of $19 million a week. You tell me how many small businesses turn over $1.9 million every week, let alone $19 million every week. That's not a small business. The government's company tax cuts are simply liberal corporate welfare for big business disguised as support for small business. And what does it do? Of course, it disadvantages small business because they lose the tax advantage that they've got compared to medium and large companies. The Greens will not support these tax cuts at a time when so many Australians are doing it tough, when we haven't got the revenue to fund schools and hospitals. We call on the Labor Party to change their position and reject this government's tax cuts. Also, one of the centrepieces of the Treasurer's economic plan is a new initiative for youth employment. Now, we welcome the government finally recognising that work for the dole has been an expensive experiment, one that has failed to provide meaningful employment for young people. It's overdue, but it's a welcome development. but we have very, very serious concerns about the internships proposed by the government in an attempt to reduce youth unemployment. It's open to young people being exploited, and it will deliver very dubious long-term employment outcomes. Our proposition is very simple. Surely, if a job exists, a young person deserves to be paid a decent wage for it. Yeah. It also raises some serious questions about people already in employment are going to lose their jobs to make way for a young person who comes with a subsidy for an employer. This has the potential for some very serious unintended consequences. Mr Acting Deputy President, this budget is yet another attack on the higher education sector, cutting 20% of funding from the university sector in the 2017 forward estimates and beyond. The government keeps saying that deregulation's off the table, that it's not dead, that deregulation is gone, that it's dead. We think it's simply hibernating until after the next election. The budget confirms that the government has abandoned the Gonski needs-based funding formula as well, and we know that it's only restored $1.2 billion of the $30 billion that Tony Abbott ripped out of schools over the next decade. Sadly, students with disabilities have been treated under this budget with complete contempt. The paltry additional funding of $118 million is a shortfall of $2.3 billion over what we know is required for the next 2 years. It's a massive underfunding in the future potential of this nation, and it lets down students and their families. Well, the Greens have got a fully costed plan to assist young students who have disabilities. It's a plan that is costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office at $4.8 billion, and again we call on the Labor Party to support it where the government has failed. Mr Acting Deputy President, the government's stubborn refusal to act on evidence that negative gearing is forcing people out of the housing market shows just how out of touch they are. Negative gearing has created a housing market dominated by speculative investors, a housing market where first home buyers are increasingly shut out. We're one of the few countries who make it easier for someone to buy their second, third, fourth, fifth property than to buy their first. The current capital gains tax discount encourages negative gearing and speculation in the property market. It drives up housing prices, it locks out first home buyers, as well as creating a rental market that is stacked in the favour of investors rather than tenants. The Greens have long argued for the removal of negative gearing and capital gains tax to end that subsidy for property investors and help ease the way for renters and new buyers. Mr Acting Deputy President, this budget also ignores the needs of social housing supply and indeed homelessness. We've got annual funding for homelessness services worth $115 million ending this year, next year, creating massive uncertainty for vulnerable people. We've got a budget that locks in Tony Abbott's harsh cuts of $600 million to the affordable rental and housing programs, and we've got an extension of Tony Abbott's asset divestment program, selling off hundreds of government-owned buildings and land that could have been used for affordable housing. We believe that much more needs to be done in this space. In addition to the Greens' policies on negative gearing and capital gains tax, we agree with the majority of economists that stamp duty should be abolished and replaced by a much fairer and more efficient land tax. Land tax is economically efficient, it's progressive, it can't be avoided by fancy accountants, and importantly, it's a potential mechanism to generate greater public investment in infrastructure. That's what real reform looks like. It just takes a bit of courage, a little bit of vision. And on the question of infrastructure, let me turn to the Governor of the Reserve Bank, who recently said we're reaching the limits of monetary policy. And the budget papers do show, as I said earlier, that we've got investment in the mining sector and the non-mining sector going backwards last year, a big slowdown in housing construction. Now, against that backdrop, the Greens have a plan for the government to borrow and invest in productivity-enhancing infrastructure. It's a pretty common-sense position. It's a position that is held by most economists and indeed by the International Monetary Fund. The Prime Minister himself has said that infrastructure is absolutely critical to Australia's future. A lot like the Prime Minister's words, if only this budget was true to his word. The budget includes only $1.2 billion in new money for infrastructure. Well, the Greens would get the Australian Infrastructure Bank established to get money flowing where we need it, into clean energy projects, into public transport projects, into important local government projects. The Greens welcome the funding to progress the East Coast Inland Freight Rail Link, but this is one bright spot on an otherwise very, very gloomy landscape. The government's stuck with its misguided toll road agenda, continuing to support traffic-inducing projects like WestConnex in Sydney, for goodness sake, what a lemon, and the Perth Freight Link in Western Australia, another dud. They've included a nod to the East-West Link in Melbourne, despite the fact that Victorian voters have said we don't want it. Building these mega roads to fix congestion is like fixing obesity by loosening our belts. Mr Acting Deputy President, the budget extends the freeze on Medicare. This is a freeze that's been going so long it's now more of an ice age. We've got a GP co-payment being introduced by stealth, by freezing the indexation on Medicare. What it does is it forces GPs to charge higher out-of-pocket costs to stay afloat, passing those costs on to patients, making it harder for them to see a doctor. We've got the government's dental plan, which rips over $1 billion out of the system. It abolishes Medicare-funded dental care, which should be built up rather than torn down. It's a budget that locks in those $50 billion of cuts to health. We've seen $180 million cut from frontline services through the reductions in the Flexible Funds program, which provides money for drug and alcohol treatment and illness prevention. Those cuts building on $1 billion already gone. There's now tripartisan support for an increase in the tobacco tax. That's a good thing. That is a good thing. Let's now turn our attention to other areas like alcohol taxation for the same reason. Mr Acting Deputy President, the Treasurer used the word Indigenous just once in his speech. When you consider that Aboriginal life expectancy and incarceration rates remain a source of national shame, and for all the fine rhetoric on closing the gap, there is still no funding for the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Implementation Plan. We have to do better. The budget also leaves women and children in danger because it fails to reverse the harsh cuts to frontline domestic violence services and leaving other crucial Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander services underfunded and facing an uncertain future. We've got specialist homelessness services for women fleeing domestic violences, again left in limbo. Despite the community and indeed the Senate rejecting cuts to family tax benefit, it remains on the government's agenda. The budget also reveals plans to drop more people off the disability support pension to help pay for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Why is it that we feel the need to hurt one vulnerable group in order to help another one? And foreign aid. After the gutting of Australia's foreign aid budget by over $11 billion since 2013, the government has savaged it further by $224 million, plunging our aid investment to a shameful 0.22% of GNI. It's the lowest level of Australian aid since records began over 50 years ago. It's an indictment on the coalition. One of those submarines, just one of them, at the cost of $4.17 billion, is more than our foreign aid will be in the year 2016-2017. The government talks a lot about national security. The best investment in our national security is at poverty alleviation in the region and around the world. Mr Acting Deputy President, billions of dollars continue to be spent on keeping people in offshore detention centres, despite the fact that Nauru and Manus Island, those camps there, are in crisis. Next year, the government is planning to spend approximately $400,000 to detain each man, woman and child in Nauru. There's no increase next year to Australia's humanitarian intake, despite the biggest global flow of refugees since World War II. A better budget, a more decent budget, would close Manus and Nauru and invest in safer pathways for people seeking asylum. Mr Acting Deputy President, last week the Greens Treasury spokesperson Adam Bandt and our Finance spokesperson Senator Peter Whish-Wilson released the party's budget principles for the 2016 federal election. They're very simple, very straightforward. We'll raise the revenue we need so that everyone can get world-class healthcare, education and other services. We'll increase GDP by growing the new clean economy. We'll get money moving from unproductive areas, like those unfair tax breaks, the huge fossil fuel subsidies, and we'll get that money working in the new economy. We'll grow the new economy and restore revenue before returning to surplus. We'll bring forward budgets that promote sustainability, well-being and that reduce inequality. The Greens Statement of Economic Principles represents a coherent, progressive and responsible approach to economic management. We are the ideas boom in Australian politics. We're the disruptors, we are the innovators. We've led the way for other parties to follow, where we chip away at those sacred cows of public policy long before it's popular. We've already announced fully costed policies by the Parliamentary Budget Office. Let's make the deficit levy permanent, worth $1.5 billion. The removal of fossil fuel subsidies, $21 billion. The Buffett rule for a high income tax guarantee so that people pay their fair share, $7 billion. The removal of negative gearing and capital gains tax, another $7 billion. The most comprehensive tax avoidance plan this country's seen to raise a minimum of $5 billion, and an infrastructure bank to release up to $75 billion into nation-building projects over the next 10 years, fully costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office. If we had a government with courage and vision, we'd be able to enact this plan. If we had a government with courage and vision, we would see some leadership and work to establish a financial transaction tax, sometimes referred to as a Tobin tax or Robin Hood tax. We do that at an international level, putting a tiny levy on those financial transactions to discourage those high-frequency transactions that add no benefit to the economy, pure speculation for no one's benefit, helping to stabilise our financial system and pricing the risk that financial transactions pose to the broader economy. It would bring in billions. I call on the government to reconsider its budget priorities and bring forward programs that fast-track vital renewable energy investment. Let's bring the clean energy generation online, let's phase out coal-fired power, and let's also recognise that battery storage is where the future lies. That's why tomorrow the Greens will announce a plan to drive uptake of batteries for households and businesses at a cost of approximately $2.8 billion. How will we pay for it? Well, it will be completely offset by removing accelerated asset depreciation for aircraft in the oil and gas industry. Now is the time to jumpstart the battery industry, to encourage the uptake of storage technologies and to help make Australia a leader. Mr Acting Deputy President, let me finish by saying that the Turnbull budget fails the challenge to transition our economy to the jobs-rich clean energy economy. It starves our schools and hospitals of funding. It chokes our cities with traffic. It prices young people out of the housing market. It wastes money on the brutal and harmful policy of offshore detention. I call on the Labor Party, please join us in ruling out a tax cut arms race and oppose cutting corporate and income taxes in the upcoming budget, because this is a budget that lets Australia down. It is not a credible or fair plan for our future. The Greens will stand up for a better budget one that takes us into a fairer, more decent, clean energy and jobs-rich future.
Thank you, Senator Dino Charlie.